have each weighed in over the past 24 hours. Let's review what they've said. The attack at the airport occurred just before 3 p.m. Eastern time. Trump offered his first reaction a little over an hour later at 4:08 p.m. as initial reports were still coming in. He tweeted, quote, "Yet another terrorist attack, this time in Turkey. Will the world ever realize what is going on? So sad." Then a second tweet a couple minutes later, "We must do everything possible to keep this horrible terrorism outside the United States." Then 5:48 p.m., nearly 3 hours after the attack, Clinton finally responded. She tweeted her official statement, driving a slightly different message, saying in part, quote, "All Americans stand united with the people of Turkey against this campaign of hatred and violence." Then at 6:12 last night, the Trump campaign sent an email to the media that read in part, "The terrorist threat has never been greater." Then a half an hour later, Trump himself spoke at a rally in St. Clairsville, Ohio, driving home that same message, talking tough on terror.
So we can't do waterboarding, but they can do chopping off heads, drowning people in steel cages. They can do whatever they want to do. You have to fight fire with fire.
Late this afternoon, back on Twitter, Trump added to what he was saying, quote, "ISIS exploded on Hillary Clinton's watch. She's done nothing about it and never will. Not capable." So, John, it's a bit of a case study for us in the world to look at how these two potential presidents have reacted to an international crisis. Who seems to be handling it better, Clinton or Trump?
Well, the only thing we could say at this point, Mark, is that Trump is handling it more aggressively and more energetically. He's been much louder on this topic than Hillary Clinton has been. I am not sure. He clearly feels confident that this is a winning issue for him. It's not 100% clear to me that saying that we have to become like the terrorists in order to beat them is necessarily either true or a winning argument politically in the long run.
Yeah, George W. Bush was very aggressive rhetorically as a commander-in-chief, as an incumbent, and basically, I think, helped himself in the election against John Kerry by talking tough. Question to me is, can a non-incumbent with no military experience, no governmental experience, get away with talking tough, or can Hillary Clinton trump that with a message of stability? I do think that Trump is appealing, certainly not just to his adherents, but to people who don't like the way things are going in the war on terror. And while President Obama has been aggressive in some ways, there's no doubt that his approval on dealing with the topic has ebbed and flowed. And if we go into a situation into the fall where there are more attacks, Trump's aggressiveness may, with the kind of voters he needs to build a coalition to win, may carry the day.
Maybe. It's possible, and there's no doubt. Look, the clearest contrast in the world between the two of them is that Trump, as he has done in a lot of ways on a lot of issues, playing very hard the fear card. You all should be afraid. Things are spiraling down the drain. We must take draconian actions. Hillary Clinton much more in favor of an approach that is more about uniting and about not the status quo, but about toughness based on resoluteness and not necessarily based on fear.
Here's what's good. Here's what's good for America and the voters. Getting a chance to see how these two people behave. I think this is pretty much how they behave in the White House. So it's actually a good real-time test for people to see which style of leadership do they want.
Right. This afternoon at the North American Leaders Summit in Ottawa, that's in Canada, President Obama held a three-way press conference with the President of Mexico and the Prime Minister of Canada, during which the President spoke about immigration, trade, and fighting terrorism.
The prayers of the American people are with the people of Turkey, the people of Istanbul, and all those who were affected by this terrible crime. We have offered all assistance that we have available to our ally, Turkey, and we stand prepared to assist them during this difficult time. We're still learning all the facts, but we know this is part of our broader shared fight against terrorist networks, and we will continue to work closely with Turkey to root them out.
The past few days have not been great for President Obama on the political front. Most people barely noticed or commented on the failure of his efforts to influence the Brexit outcome in the United Kingdom. He was obviously in favor of Remain and went to England to say so. And then the attack in Turkey has been shining another light on his struggle, the president's that is, to rally a global coalition against Islamic State. So, Mark, what do the events of these past days suggest about the relative lame duckness of President Obama's lame duck status?
Boy, I was surprised in the wake of the Brexit vote that people didn't sort of see it as a bigger loss for the president. Put a lot of capital down. Got more attention when he tried to win the World Cup for the U.S. and failed than he did for this in some ways. So I think it's cautionary for the White House. Now, look, the president has been counted out before and come back. He's got some international travel. He's still the president. But I thought this was a real sign on both these issues of certainly waning influence. You know, his approval rating in the most recent data we've seen from CNN on handling terror, 42%, handling ISIS, 38%. It is pretty clear that the world is not necessarily looking to him for leadership now the way they once did. And it is a caution for him, a caution for Hillary Clinton, the White House staff. But like I said, he's been counted out before and come back, particularly on the international stage.
Well, look, I mean, foreign policy is the weak spot for President Obama, but if you compare his lame duckness to the following former presidents in our lifetime, George W. Bush at the end of his second term, Bill Clinton at the end of his second term, President Obama is a titan compared to those guys in terms of both his approval rating compared to both of them and in terms of his ability to have a role in this presidential campaign. Domestically, the president is very strong, but on the world stage, there's no doubt that he is not playing a very strong hand. That's been the case in his administration for a while.
Yeah, we may see a flip. Presidents normally turn to foreign policy at the end. This president may turn to politics and domestic issues. See how that goes. When we come back, what do Ted Cruz and John Kasich have up their respective sleeves ahead of the Cleveland convention? We'll read some of the tea leaves after these words from our sponsors.
Yesterday, we showed you part of Donald Trump's protectionist trade speech, the one where he was standing in front of a wall of trash in western Pennsylvania. It turns out the Chamber of Commerce, traditionally one of the most reliable of all Republican allies, had a little problem with some of the things that Trump is proposing. The Chamber put out a statement defending American trade policies and responded directly to Trump on Twitter, including a tweet that said, quote, "Under Trump's trade plans, we would see higher prices, fewer jobs, a weaker economy." This morning, Trump fired back, quote, "Why would the U.S. Chamber be upset by the fact that I want to negotiate better and stronger trade deals or that I want penalties for cheaters?" And in another tweet, quote, "The U.S. Chamber must fight harder for the American worker. China and many others are taking advantage of U.S. with our terrible trade pacts." Then, late this afternoon at his rally in Maine, the presumptive Republican nominee showed off some of his knowledge about this very complex policy issue.
By the way, I know every form of trade. Fair trade, good trade, bad trade, free trade. There's hundreds of names. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is totally controlled by the special interest groups, folks, just so you understand it. They're upset with my statements on trade. And I said, let me ask you a question. And I tweeted, why? Why would you be upset? I'm all for free trade. The problem with free trade is you need smart people making deals. We don't have good deals. And free trade is killing us.
So, Mark, we are still at least a little more than a month away from the baseball trade deadline. But before we get there, I want to ask you, how big a political price do you think Trump may pay for abandoning a key element of Republican orthodoxy and in the process really annoying a large part of the Republican business establishment?
Well, he'll certainly pay some. There'll be more elites who endorse Hillary Clinton. And my hat's off to the chamber for standing on principle for what they believe in. Look, Bill Clinton ran against his party's trade position in '92 and was able to basically expand the Democratic electorate enough to win. I think Republicans who don't agree with Trump on trade are just going to have to get used to it. It's a big part of his campaign. And if there is a path to not only winning 270 electoral votes, but expanding the Republican electorate for down-ballot candidates, it seems to me it's through working-class voters who are as skeptical of current trade practices as Trump. So while it's going to cause some friction, I don't think it's going to break apart a voting coalition. It'll hurt him with some elites.
Well, a lot of it's going to depend, I think, on how well Hillary Clinton handles this, because the truth is, in terms of globalization, which is really what Trump's railing against here, and as much as he's railing against any specific trade deals, he's trying to turn back the clock on an inexorable force that's changed our economy over the course of the last 20, 30 years. You know, Trump, as many people have suffered from that, there are those who have gained from it. So it's not clear to me that Trump is going to win from this politically, but the question is whether Hillary Clinton can actually capitalize on it, given her conflicts over the issue of free trade and protectionism.
Yeah, you know, the chamber is really focused on down-ballot races, but if Trump looks like he can win this thing at the end, I think you're going to see some groups that are skeptical. Maybe not the chamber, but groups like that, business groups, get on board with Trump if they think he can win it at the end. All right, a little more than 2 weeks out from the Republican convention in Cleveland. Naturally, a lot of attention is turned to who's going to be attending and who's going to speak from the stage. Apparently, still the case that the home state governor, John Kasich, isn't sure about either of his options. His spokesman told CNN today that Kasich may not step foot in the convention hall. But the chief strategist of Kasich's presidential campaign, John Weaver, sent out a very unusual email today about a new series of swing state polls from something called Ballotpedia that show Kasich doing better in a hypothetical matchup against Clinton in several battleground states than Trump does. We're told by a source close to Kasich that he will be in Cleveland. He'll be doing plenty of events to help candidates besides Trump, but at this point doesn't have any plans to step inside the hall. That could change. We'll see. Meanwhile, Senator Ted Cruz, another vanquished opponent of Trump's, has been even harder to pin down about what he plans in Cleveland. Cruz spokesman told the New York Times there's no expectation that he'll get a speaking slot, though under the current Republican rules, he did win enough states to technically qualify to get his name put in nomination and get to speak. Cruz loyalists may also play a significant role on some of the key committees that draft the party rules and platform a week before the convention begins. We are told by sources close to Cruz that he plans to be in Cleveland not for the entire convention, not clear which day he'll go. He's going to do a lot. He wants to do a lot to hang out with and thank and meet with his own supporters, many of whom are delegates at the convention. So leaving option open there to perhaps extend his stay. John, given all that, what do you think Ted Cruz and John Kasich are currently thinking about best case for them in Cleveland?
Well, I think John Kasich is trying to avoid getting any Donald Trump all over his suit. And I think Ted Cruz is trying to keep his option open in case this dump Trump thing does catch on. He's obviously the most likely next nominee in the party, given that he has the second most delegates and the greatest standing to knock Trump off if that movement emerges among the delegates. Those seem to me to be the games that the two are playing.
Neither of these guys want to hug Donald Trump at this point. Most of their team feels the same way pretty strongly. They also both, at this point, see themselves as potential frontrunners for 2020 if Trump loses. And people sometimes have lost sight of the fact that a lot of what goes on in the convention normally when there's not talk in the air of disrupting the convention or even overturning the will of the voters, a lot of what goes on is positioning for 4 years down the road. And again, I'd say at this point, you look at the 15 people who ran against Trump, the two who I think have spent the most time thinking about what 2020 might look like against Hillary Clinton are Ted Cruz and John Kasich and the people around them.
For sure. Those Ballotpedia numbers that you mentioned are very strong for Kasich, and our indications are that Kasich intends to do a lot of campaigning for down-ballot Republicans from what he considers a mainstream conservative perspective. If Kasich goes out without any of what he sees as the taint of Trump on him and campaigns successfully for those down-ballot candidates, it will give him, in his mind at least, a boost in the way you're talking about in terms of 2020 for sure.
It's a big sweepstakes that hadn't gotten much attention. If Trump is not in demand for people like Rob Portman, Kelly Ayotte, et cetera, maybe it will be not. Who are the stars? You know, is it George Bush is raising money for him, but who's out on the trail as a big surrogate? Kasich and Cruz, I think, are both looking to do that. All right, coming up, we'll talk more about the presidential race and also the aftermath of this horrible terrorist attacks in Turkey when we come right back.
Clearly needs to change, in my opinion, to win the general election. What I've said to him both publicly and privately, you're a great entertainer, you turn on audiences, you know, you're good before a crowd, you have a lot of Twitter followers, that worked fine for you in the primaries, but now that you're in the general, people are looking for a level of seriousness that's typically conveyed by having a prepared text and teleprompter and staying on message. So my hope is that he's beginning to pivot and become what I would call a more serious and credible candidate for the highest office in the land.
So that was Republican Senator Mitch McConnell, the GOP leader of the Senate, speaking to New York One about his party's presumptive nominee. Joining us now to talk about the state of the race, former Bush Communications Director Nicole Wallace, also an MSNBC political analyst. She wrote an op-ed for today's New York Times titled "The GOP Waits and Waits for Donald Trump to Grow Up." And it reads in part this: party leaders have watched the last 8 weeks of the Trump candidacy the way you experience a chase scene in a dream where your legs never move fast enough to outrun the three-headed dragon on roller skates, which we have pictured here. So Nicole,
I just noticed that. That's incredible.
There it is. Haven't seen one of those lately.
Yeah.
So Mitch McConnell seems to be like Exhibit A, not listening to the Wallace doctrine, which is stop encouraging the guy to change or waiting for him to change.
Well, it's intractable, right? Everyone is waiting for something that's never going to happen. And Donald Trump, on the other hand, is waiting for respect that he feels that he's entitled to for what is undeniably a massive political accomplishment. After losing in Wisconsin, he went on to win every primary after that by massive margins. He thinks he can transform the Republican Party. Leaders are not impressed. Leaders, for their part, find cause to rebuke him about every 7 days. And I wrote the piece before I saw that today John McCain rebuked him for his position on waterboarding. So he made it exactly 7 days.
Let me push back on your thesis. It seems to me that Paul Ryan, for instance, when he's been a critic of Trump, Trump has changed his ways. Not every time, but that some of the criticism, some of the critique, some of the private advice actually does, at least on the margins, make him more measured, more in the mold of what they'd want.
Well, listen, he wants to win. So I think when he stumbles, after Wisconsin's a good example, after the last month, which has been roundly criticized as a wasted period of time when he could have been sort of beefing up his campaign, raising money. He had racism scandal after racism scandal. He called a judge a Mexican who was born in America because he thought he was biased against him. He got himself tangled up in all sorts of sort of trouble from his unscripted moments, mostly on morning talk shows. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive. Growing a little bit as a candidate is normal when you go from being a reality TV star to the nominee of a party. But this idea that everyone is waiting for him to be normal is a fantasy.
John?
Nicole, I want to ask you about what we saw from Donald Trump in the last 24 hours since the Istanbul attack. He says we got to basically fight the way the terrorists fight if we're going to win. We got to be super violent, and we got to kind of like not be so constrained by those gosh darn laws that we have on the books. Is that helping him to clear the commander-in-chief threshold or hurting him?
It's helping him clear a different threshold. As you know, and I saw your comments this morning, is an obvious problem in his point of view that we are not them, and that's the very point. So we cannot engage in their tactics. But his numbers on the question of terrorism are about the only ones that held up during what was the most abysmal month for any candidate for the presidency that I can remember. The only place where he still had an advantage over Hillary Clinton was on this question of who do you trust to protect us from terrorists, or who do you trust on the question of terrorism. So he is on solid political ground, but the question when it's asked about who's most qualified to be the commander-in-chief, who's the steadiest leader, she still has the advantage. So in some ways, he's got the public behind him when he talks about being tough on terrorists. People view a terrorist who would kill innocent people in an airport, children and families going on vacation, which were the targets of yesterday's attack, they view them as animals. And so most people, even while a debate roiled Congress, John McCain came out firmly against enhanced interrogation methods, but many members of the public remained supportive of doing whatever we had to do to defeat them. So Donald Trump is on solid political ground, but it's not the kind of ground you stand on if you're trying to pass a credible commander-in-chief test. And it's why you see some national security leaders, people who have worked for Republican presidents, coming out in recent weeks to endorse Hillary Clinton.
Right. So, Nicole, you've laid out the conundrum pretty well, that Trump's on, there's some political advantage, or at least some mileage in terms of how he's addressing these kind of issues, but there's also this more fundamental test. So if you were advising Trump, if he called you and said, Nicole, how should I talk about this? How much should I moderate? What would your advice be to him, and in terms of how to balance those two objectives?
Well, listen, Mike Hayden said in a great piece called Spy Masters, which was shared on Showtime, he said, the next president that wants to waterboard is going to have to bring his own bucket. So I would advise Donald Trump to get on the phone with Mike Hayden, who's pretty available and pretty accessible, and find out what experts think on this question. And that is the very point of the piece today. Why isn't he on the phone with policy experts? If terrorism is an opportunity for Donald Trump to fix his political problem, which is that he needs to close the gender gap, he needs to get more married women to trust him on national security more than they trust Hillary Clinton, why isn't he spending the same amount of time he spends on Twitter and on TV talking to really smart policy people like Mike Hayden or Jim Woolsey, who I know is coming on your show next?
What do you think of Ted Cruz's posture towards Trump at this point in terms of whether it's smart for him, whether there's any downside?
Listen, the largest growing group of voters is, Republicans in the Senate, and their group is undecided. Mike Lee said yesterday on Morning Joe that he's not sure he's going to endorse. Jeff Flake has said he's not sure if he's going to endorse. Cruz hasn't endorsed. Kasich hasn't endorsed. I think that the question, when Jeb Bush said he wasn't going to vote in the presidential contest, he got a lot of flack, but it is now a position and sort of a...
Does Cruz pay any price with anybody for saying, I don't really know what I'm going to do about Trump?
Well, I don't think anyone assumes that Ted Cruz will vote for Hillary Clinton, but if you can't pull the lever for Donald Trump, that's a powerful statement. And whether or not he'll pay a price with the huge swath of Republicans, I think Trump has an 80% approval rating among Republicans. Republican voters want to see Republican leaders get behind Trump.
Right,
so I think it's very possible that he pays a price among voters for not doing that.
For a while, the Never Trump movement had all sorts of oxygen, and now obviously it has significantly less.
Never had all that much.
But in media oxygen.
It never had any viability.
Is there now going to come more pressure on Republicans to get in line, do you think?
Well, I think they're going to have to stake out a position, and I think there are two doors. You can vote for Hillary Clinton or you can vote for Donald Trump. I think this idea that they're going to sit it out, I think voters will... I'm an undecided voter. I mean, I laid out my quagmire and my sort of, therapy process that I'm through. I'm waiting for him to get better. I find it inexplicable that he can't read, the looming tower and have anything more intelligent to say about the nature of the enemy we face and how to fight them.
I'm going on Amazon, getting him Looming Tower, send it to Trump. Sending Looming Tower to Trump Tower. All right, Nicole's going to stay with us. It might be a surprise to her. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about the terrorist attacks in Turkey with the former director of the CIA, James Woolsey, right after this. Welcome back. World is still wrestling with yesterday's suicide attacks in Turkey, killed dozens of travelers at Istanbul's main airport. We're joined now from Washington by the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, James Woolsey. Nicole Wallace still with us. Mr. Woolsey, what could the U.S. government be doing that would be more aggressive than President Obama is currently doing to fight against ISIS and other terrorists around the world?
As of now, we're playing like a game as if we were the hockey goalie, and any shot on net in the whole season that gets through our catching it, we lose everything. we've got to do a better job of getting inside the heads of our enemy. And one thing is to call them for what they are, jihadi, Islamist terrorists, and not to mince words the way the president does all the time, because you can't work effectively on something you can't even talk about. But the other is, I think, to take notice of the fact that we're going to have to make some serious compromises. We all want our privacy. We also all want security. In a normal, average, pleasant day in the United States and other parts of the world, too, security and privacy don't really clash that much. But when you get attacked by particularly an institution as ruthless as ISIS, they do begin to clash. And what we have to do is essentially develop a public-private partnership so that the people in the government, in NSA especially, but other parts of it, that are real experts on data and what one can do with it, and people from the essentially the data industry that are very good at pulling together information on people from publicly available, non-owned data, and helping figure out from that data where an individual group is going to be going the next day, whether they have bought some new kind of material or weapons, whatever. One has to be able to untangle what they are doing. And some people will say that might affect my privacy. It conceivably could. But we've got to make some choices, and I think we're going to have to compromise a bit on both privacy and security.
All right, Ambassador Woolsey, a question from Nicole Wallace.
Sir, have you been in contact with the Trump campaign to offer any of these kinds of insights or any of your knowledge or impart any of that on him?
Nope. I'm an old Scoop Jackson, Joe Lieberman Democrat, and at this point in the campaign, neither campaign has gotten in touch with me.
And do you think there's anything disqualifying about the kinds of things that Donald Trump has said about the nature of the enemy or the things we would do to protect ourselves? Does the Muslim ban disqualify him? Does the talk about bringing back waterboarding, where a debate's been had and we decided that wasn't in line with our values? Has he staked out any ground on counterterror that disqualifies him from the presidency?
There are things that I agree with and disagree with that he says. I'll mention a couple here, but I don't think anything is disqualifying. I mean, one can say all sorts of things. It's a free country, First Amendment. I think that the trying to keep Muslims out as Muslims was a bad decision because
walked it back,
that almost
in fairness.
certainly. Say again?
He's walked that back, and now he describes it as a ban against people from certain terror regions, in fairness to him.
That could be quite legal, to ban people from Syria, say, for a time. But I think you run into the First Amendment if you try to ban Muslims. I also think that his ideas on trade are much too restrictive. There can be some compromises with free trade, but generally we ought to be free traders, I think, for the interests of prosperity. And I think I disagree with him on that. But I'm not going to say any of these things disqualify him for running for the presidency. I just disagree.
Mr. Ambassador, if the Turkish government came to you and said, we'll do whatever you say to fight against terrorism, what would you ask them to do?
Work out a modus vivendi with the Kurds so that these two wonderful fighting forces in the Middle East, each of whom has been working with us at one time or another, the Kurds and the Turks, could cooperate with us. We would have to be overseeing it all, and the anger and hatred there is long-standing. But these are both extraordinarily able groups of fighting men and women. And I think if we could do something to pull them together with us, okay, keep them on separate flanks so they don't have to talk to one another. But I think the key to victory again over ISIS in Syria and Iraq, and over the long run to any use of force that ISIS may contemplate, really probably lies in getting all of the Sunnis, as many as possible, together, and especially the Kurds and Shia.
Is it a fair...
the Kurds and Turks. Sorry.
Sir, is there a fair case to be made by conservatives that when the president refused to enforce the red line he drew in Syria based on Assad using chemical weapons on his own people, is there a fair argument to make that when that happened, that put into motion a weakening of American credibility, an emboldening of the enemy, an emboldening of Russia and their role? I mean, is there a conservative case, a thoughtful policy case to be made that some of our problems are rooted in that single action?
Oh, I think there's a conservative case, a medium case, and a liberal case. I think it was one of the two worst decisions on foreign policy of the Obama administration. It made us look weak. It enhanced the stature of the Russians in the Middle East. It made America's word look like it wasn't worth anything. It was a very bad decision, I think, whatever your politics.
Mr. Ambassador,
the other one, I think...
Go ahead. What was the other bad decision?
I think the other really bad one was supporting and endorsing the so-called nuclear deal with Iran, which is completely unenforceable and very easy to essentially subvent by going around. I think that freeing up $150 billion to the world's #1 terrorist state so they can double and redouble their terrorist work is about as stupid as foreign policy decisions get.
Okay, Ambassador James Woolsey, former head of the CIA. Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Cole Wallace, thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up, more about Donald Trump's speech in Maine today, right after this.
Just remember this. They signed a pledge saying they will abide, saying they will back the candidate of the party. And now they sit back, and the pledge is out there, and the press doesn't even go after them on that. They broke their word. In my opinion, they should never be allowed to run for public office again, because what they did is disgraceful.
That was Donald J. Trump at his rally in Bangor, Maine, just moments ago, talking about some of his former Republican rivals who have not yet endorsed him. Our next guests also have not yet endorsed Donald Trump. From Philadelphia, Republican strategist Kim Alfano, and here with me in Washington, D.C., Tim Miller, an advisor to the Anti-Trump Our Principles PAC. and former communications director for Jeb Bush's presidential campaign. Thank you both for joining us today. Tim, in this instance, I will give pride of place to proximity rather than appealingness, because, of course, Kim is much more appealing than you in every way. I'm going to ask you both about Dump Trump. Dump Trump. We're headed to Cleveland pretty soon. What are the odds that Trump will be dumped?
Look, I think the odds are pretty low, to be honest, but it's a realistic chance and it's a real opportunity to do so. And I think that the reality is that the delegates are unbound legally, and I think that there is going to be a legitimate objection to him at the convention, and there should be, because look, Donald Trump is an exceptional candidate. He's an extreme candidate. He's outside of the mainstream of the Republican Party, and I think there's a huge minority segment within the party that is not in line with him on the issues. He can't beat Hillary Clinton in November, and so I think that we're going to have some fireworks in Cleveland.
I just want to ask you, before I go to Kim, real quick, if that's the case, why have you failed so miserably at convincing the people in your party, the good people of your party, to actually go ahead and dump this guy?
Well, look, we had a very fragmented field. Look, there were 17 candidates. Trump ended up winning, about 46, 47% of the vote, even towards the very end. He never did win a majority of the party. Trump was successful in playing with or in taking advantage of some of the fractures within the Republican Party base, and I think that we've seen that. But that does not mean that there should not be an objection to a candidate who's exceptionally bad on a number of different issues.
Kim, you say that Trump will not be dumped. Why?
Because if you look at the RNC at this point, they're already 100% on board, and I think that there's not as salacious an alternative. And if this election has taught us anything, it's that you have to be pretty entertaining and pretty out there to wake people up from the sort of doldrums that they've had of typical political, rhetoric for so long. So I don't see anyone. I loved John Kasich. He was my guy. I don't see how he takes the stage and steals it. He's just not that kind of person.
Kim, if Trump asks you for your best piece of advice now to increase his chance of winning, what would the advice be?
I would say do what you're doing, but make sure you're walking back the stuff that is really out there. I think that he's been pretty brilliant in this kind of buckshot or scattershot approach where he blows the doors off with something that makes everybody just sort of jolt with like a huh? And then weeks later, since he does so many, one after another, the jolt is forgotten and he's able to walk it back, kind of like the Muslim ban. And I think it's just he has this electrical way of going after voters and getting them to pay attention, and it's not dumb. I think he's doing a great job of it. I don't love the guy. I don't necessarily know what I'm going to do, but I do give him kudos for understanding how to talk to people this year.
Tim, if Trump comes out of Cleveland as the nominee, tell me the best case you see for your party for the fall in terms of down-ballot races.
Well, look, I think the reality is Trump's going to get worse, not better. And there's this wishful thinking in Washington, and I think Kim expressed part of that, and a lot of the folks in the establishment in D.C. think that he's going to start behaving better. And the reality is he's going to get crushed by Hillary Clinton, and Donald Trump is a toddler. And when toddlers don't get what they want, they act out. They don't start to behave better. And so what we're going to see when Hillary Clinton's beating him by 6, 7, 8, 9 points around Labor Day is Donald Trump's going to start to act out. And I think you're going to see a lot of our Senate and House candidates have to separate themselves from him, and hopefully with money and resources from anti-Trump conservatives, we can save the House and hopefully at least keep it close in the Senate, where a lot of senators are running good campaigns, like Pat Toomey, for example, but they're going to get drugged down by just absolute atrocity at the top of the ticket.
Right, so the atrocity is how bad, Tim? How bad do you think it could get for Donald Trump? How bad do you think it is likely to be?
I think he certainly is going to be worse than McCain in 2008. He's going to lose Arizona. I think Georgia is going to go into play. And I think in the national ballot, which is going to be the real problem in states like Texas, where there are going to be congressional districts that come into play, he'll probably still win a lot of these red states, but I think his percentages are going to be far, far lower than what we've seen from Romney and McCain.
Kim, you think that Donald Trump can actually win, and what do you think? I mean, do you think that's a slim possibility, or do you think that he's basically a coin flip with Hillary Clinton?
Well, I mean, each of them are dramatically flawed. So let's not underestimate their flaws. But I would say that, you know, in politics, it's head and it's heart. And right now, or gut is a better way to describe it. And right now, people are scared. People are worried. People have been ignited, and their fears have been stoked. And, you know, even though there's a lot of smart people that I know, really smart people, that nod their head when Donald Trump says, we've got to fight back. They're smart, but they're answering viscerally because they're scared. I mean, one after another of a terror attack, you know, jobs continuing to be lost. These are real things in real people's lives, and I think Trump has tapped into that, and I think that that they may be willing to just suspend reality and go for it just to see what happens, because they know exactly what they're going to get in Hillary Clinton.
Tim, your old friend John Weaver, close to John Kasich, sent out the polls we talked about earlier about how Kasich and Ryan are doing better than Trump against Clinton in a lot of places. What do you think John Weaver and John Kasich are up to?
Well, John Weaver's a noted troublemaker, so my guess is what he's up to is making a little bit of trouble. Look, like I said to John Heilman, I think that there is going to be some pushback in Cleveland, and there is good reason for there to be. The worse the polls look, the worse Trump's behavior gets, and the more delegates realize their options, and they do have real options to get rid of Donald Trump. I think that you could see, you know, a potential challenge to Donald Trump on the floor. Obviously, it's John Kasich's home state. He has existing delegates, as does Cruz and Rubio, so those would be the most likely people to be able to take advantage of that. Again, I think this is an outside chance, but given how bad the polls are and Trump's behavior and his campaign disorganization of late, and the increasing organization of the anti-Trump delegates, I think that that's probably what John Weaver was looking at when he sent that email out.
Kim, if Donald Trump is choosing between Chris Christie, Newt Gingrich, Mary Fallon, and Senator Corker, which of those four would be the smartest pick?
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
It truly doesn't matter. According to the Raba poll, it doesn't help him in fundraising, and beyond that, you know, he's the ticket. Unless there's somebody we haven't thought of, picking another political, you know, known quantity doesn't do anything for him one way or another. People realize that no matter who he picks, even if it's a moderately, you know, even-tempered political, you know, old hand, it's not going to affect the way Donald Trump acts. And if he picks, you know, someone who's completely, you know, exciting and from we never thought of, I mean, I'd have to see who it was, but still, Donald Trump's a pretty light and loud head of the ticket to even be outshined by anyone.
All right, Kim, Ray of Sunshine Alfano, and Tim, Rain Cloud Miller, thank you for coming on. Up next, we'll get an update on Turkey and how the world is responding to this terrible terrorist attack. And if you're watching us here in Washington, D.C., you can listen to us as well on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM. We'll be right back.
Joining us now here in the studio is NBC News foreign correspondent Ayman Mohyeldin. Lots of terrorist attacks. The casualties are always horrible. What is different in terms of the symbolism or the effect of this attack?
Well, this one, it really targets the commercial and, if you will, kind of symbolic epicenter of Turkey. You know, most of the attacks that we've seen in the past, certainly there's been some in Istanbul at tourist destinations and stuff, but this is really going after the establishment, if you will, both because it's Istanbul and that is the commercial center of Turkey, but also that specific airport. It's the third largest in Europe, one of the largest in the world. It is a hub for the entire region. It connects the world, as we heard President Obama say. So they're targeting it and they're sending a message not just to Turkey, but to the outer world.
Turkey has dealt with a lot of domestic terrorism. Is this going to change Turkey's attitude towards fighting back?
Well, in terms of if they determine that it is ISIS, yes, Turkey's already involved in the fight in Syria. Perhaps they can do more alone. There's a reluctance on a lot of the neighboring countries to do it alone without direct U.S. military involvement in a way that would protect everybody that would go to stake. Because if they go to war in Syria, and that means they have to go up against the Assad regime or its anti-defense systems or even maybe Russian fighter jets, they want to know that the U.S. has their back in that fight. I'm not sure that Turkey or any of the neighboring countries, Jordan did a few flyovers, did some bombings. I don't think any of them are ready to do it in the event that the U.S. is not going to back those countries 100%. If this turns out to be Kurdish separatists, as we've seen in the past, I think it would add a very dangerous new dynamic to that war that's been taking place in southeastern Turkey for decades.
Given lame duck president of the United States, given the distraction of Brexit and all the other problems in the world, is it conceivable that there'd be a change in how the war on terror is fought with or without American leadership between now and the election of a new American president?
Well, we've heard some countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia say they wanted to try to create a rapid deployment force among Arab countries. I don't think a lot of people are putting a lot of weight into that. I don't think it's going to deal with the meaty issues of the region like, for example, a Syria or even an Iraq. Perhaps maybe something in Yemen, maybe in the borders of Libya, but nothing as serious as Syria. So I don't see any seismic shifts in the security structure of the region right now. Nobody's willing to make that change. Very unlikely to happen unless the U.S. says, we are going to do this, let's get everyone on board.
If there's an actor in the region who would lead that, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, is there anyone who would say, we can't wait for a new American president?
Well, if there's a country that's going to lead it, it's going to try and pull the international community with it. Perhaps the only country that could do that is Turkey because of the fact that it is a member of NATO and is on the European doorstep. So it can literally bring the Europeans dragging to this particular field of operation, if you will. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, not likely to do that. Egypt is strained at home with what the problems that it is dealing with in the Sinai Peninsula and the rise of ISIS there. A lot of economic problems at home. It's not going to be able to project its power. Saudi Arabia could probably have the resources to project its power, but it's dragged down in a brutal war in Yemen that shows no end in sight. That military campaign has not gone too well for the Saudi regime. I'm not sure they would be able and capable of opening a second front anywhere beyond their borders.
And what about other European countries? Are there any of them at this point so unhappy with the status quo after this attack that they try to lobby for more?
Well, what we've seen in the past, countries like France, you know, in the wake of the Paris attacks, they showed an immediate, robust military activity in Syria. They launched their air campaign, but with time, it tends to die down, or at least the pace of intensity slows down. So again, I'm not sure that any European country has the capability to do it. The United Kingdom perhaps does, but just given the past week with Brexit, I think their hands are completely full right now with everything that's going on domestically. They're going to be preoccupied with that for months. I'm not sure that they'll be willing, given the economic uncertainty that they're dealing with now in Europe, that they're going to try to take on a military campaign to try to reshape the conflict in Syria without a very strong international presence. And any effort they try to do is always going to be met with some kind of diplomatic pushback, even military pushback from Iran, Hezbollah that are supporting the Assad regime as well as Russia.
All right, Ayman, thank you much. Great to have you here. We'll be right back.
Immediately, right now, you should head to BloombergPolitics.com, where you'll find a piece by Ben Brody about Clinton aide Huma Abedin's deposition about her boss's State Department email use. Coming up on Bloomberg TV, Emily Chang speaks to Box CEO Aaron Levine about Brexit. That's on Bloomberg West. Until tomorrow, from me here in Washington, Mark there in New York, we say to you, sayonara.